Today, I'm making myself a blouse so that I can match with my boyfriend. A couple of weeks ago, I made my partner a shirt. I have a whole tutorial on it if you want to go and check that out. However, I still have just about over half a meter of fabric left. But first, if you're new here, hi, I'm Olga and I make sewing content that is usually vintage inspired and sometimes a little bit nerdy. So the fabric that I'm going to be using, in case you missed that video, is this really pretty viscose challis from Minerva. This is called Dantes Dreamscape. And for the pattern, I am going to be using one from Gertie's new book for better sewing. It's the first time I'm using this book. So I'm going to be using the all-in-one sleeve blouse. I have never done a pattern from this book, so this is going to be a bit of a wearable mock-up. So if it turns out cute, amazing. If it doesn't turn out super cute or it doesn't fit me all that well, it's not a huge deal. I have copied out everything that I need to, but I still need to draft a couple of things. So first I need to kind of change the back facing a little bit. Because I'm hacking this slightly, I need the back facing to be a slightly different shape at the top so that it will connect to the front facing and it'll have like a nice shoulder seam. I need to draft the neckline or like front facing. And then I also need to draft the Peter Pan collar, which hopefully I will have enough fabric for. I know that 100% I do have enough fabric for the blouse, like for the body of the blouse. And I think the facings, but if I don't have enough for the facings and the Peter Pan collar, I might opt for the Peter Pan collar and then cut the facings out of a plain white cotton that I have that I think would work out just fine. It'll add a bit of structure. It'll save me some interfacing. So let's go get started on that and yeah, hopefully get a really cute blouse at the end of this. I use wrapping paper for my pattern drafting because it's really easy to find and super cheap. So I'm just rolling it out on my desk to get started with drafting the bits I need, and I'm using my pattern weights to keep that all in place. To draft the front neckline facing, I start by tracing the neckline of the pattern, including the center front and shoulder seam. Since my pattern already has a seam allowance included, I don't need to add that to the line I just traced. I extend the shoulder and center front lines to whatever size I want my facings to be. I did 5 centimeters or 2 inches in this case. Anyway, then I have to connect the shoulder seam to the center front, keeping the distance from the neckline even. To do this, I used my seam gauge and marked out a few points that I could then connect. Then I marked the pattern piece, labeling which side is the centerfold, how many I need to cut, and what pattern these facings actually belong to. For the back facings, the pattern already had some, which I will be using. However, they don't come all the way up to the shoulder seams, so I did decide to change that. I used a scrap piece of paper and I taped it to the top of the back facing pattern. Then I realized I needed it more like off to the side, so I chopped some off and taped it to the correct location. Now I basically repeat the same thing I just did for the front. I trace the neckline and shoulder seam, and I make sure the width of the shoulder seam of the back facing is the same size as the shoulder seam on the front facing, so they'll actually match up when I sew them together. Then I add a bit of shaping to connect the original facing to this new section in a way that looks sort of neat and purposeful, I guess. To draft the Peter Pan collar, I started by drawing in the seam lines or stitching lines on the blouse pattern. The seam allowance for this specific pattern is 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch. Then I place both front and back over some paper, matching the shoulder seam lines and lining up the neckline, and I trace that onto the paper. I only realized this pencil was probably hard to see on camera at this point, which is why I switched over to a marker. Now that I have the neckline, center front, and center back traced, I went in with my seam gauge and added in the seam line of the collar, again 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch from the line I traced. Then I add several lines 5 centimeters or 2 inches away from that line I just drew, so from the seam line of the collar. I connect those lines, which forms a facing of sorts, so here is where you make this your own. You can now use a French curve if you have one, or a ruler, or just freehand and make the collar shape you want. I went with a very simple, like rounded shape at the front and a square shape at the back. Now I add seam allowance to the outer edge of the collar, and I make sure to add the same as the rest of the pattern to make my life easier when I actually sew this again in the future. I mark the pattern. I'll need to cut 4 fabric and 2 interfacing pieces, and I also add what pattern this is for. With all the pattern pieces ready, I laid out my fabric with right sides together on the desk with my cutting mat under, because you know I'm going to be using the cutting mat and rotary cutter combo for this viscose challis. Whenever I'm working with limited amounts of fabric like this, it always takes a while to place everything on the fabric because I'm trying to make sure I'm getting as much out of the fabric as possible while keeping grain lines in mind and pattern direction and all that jazz.
so it's a bit like doing a puzzle. Once I had settled on the placement, I cut everything out and marked. I'm just marking the darts with friction pen and the buttonholes with Tailor's tacks. I ended up having to cut out the back facings from some white cotton that I had in my remnants pile and having to piece it together actually. And I also went ahead and cut out the interfacing for the front facing and the collar and fused it off camera. I decided to do this with batch sewing today because I've been having a flare up and wanted to get this blouse done a little quicker. That's also why I missed last week's upload. I had the footage all ready to edit for this blouse, but no energy to do it. Anyway, batch sewing was a good idea on this day because I drafted, cut, and sewed this whole blouse in a work day, so it's definitely faster for me. So I pinned the back facing bits at the bottom that I need to piece together, as well as the front and back facings at the shoulder seams, all with right sides together. Then I pinned each interfaced collar piece to an uninterfaced one along the outer edges. And I also pinned my darts flat, as always. Next, I stitched all of that in place. For the darts, I only backstitch at the white part of the dart, and for the tips, I left the thread tails long and tied them off manually, as I always do. Everything else I sew normally, making sure to backstitch at the start and finish of every seam, and sewing everything in one go. Then I trimmed the seam allowances on the collar pieces and flipped them right side out so that I could press them flat off camera. I also trimmed the seam allowances on the facings and pressed the seams towards the back, and I tied off the threads of the darts and pressed them towards the back as well. With that done, I pinned the back pieces to the front at the shoulders and sides. The beauty of this style of all-in-one sleeve blouse is that it's so easy to put together. When I had those seams sewn, I trimmed the seam allowances and zigzagged the raw edges. I also did the edges on the facings to prep them for sewing them into the blouse. I pressed the seams towards the back off camera, and then I started pinning again. For this batch, I pinned up the hem on the sleeves by folding it twice, first along the seam allowance and then a second time to tuck away the raw edges. I also pinned the facings to the blouse, and when I had finished doing that, I realized I'd forgotten to sandwich the collar in there, so I unpinned around the collar area, pinned the collar in with the uninterfaced side up against the blouse, and then I pinned the facings over it. Then I stitched all of those seams in place. I trimmed the seam allowance off the facings, clipped the corners, turned everything out to the right side, and pressed the whole thing in place off camera. Next, I tacked the facings down to the blouse at the shoulder seams, but I was finding that the facings still wanted to pop to the outside, especially the front ones, so I decided to add some stop stitching to keep them in place. But before I did that, I actually wanted to sew the facings at the hem for a neater finish at the end. So I flipped the facings to the outside along the hem, stitched them down along the hem allowance. I trimmed just the facing and the corner off the hem, and then I flipped the facings back to the inside and started the top stitching. I did a line up the back on both sides and then around the neckline under the collar so that I was keeping the collar free from the stitching. Then I moved on to pinning up the hem, and I did the same as I did for the sleeves. I just fold the fabric once, pin, or I guess clipped in this case, and then I folded the raw edge in and pinned again. And of course, I also top stitched that in place. Just like that, it was time for buttons, so I picked some out from my stash. I went with this kind of pearlescent yellow ones, and I ended up marking out my own placements with the size of the buttons and all of that. I mostly did this because all of the Tailor's tacks kept coming out because I didn't do them very well. But also, I like picking my own button placement, so it's totally fine. I made the buttonholes over on the sewing machine, and then I stitched the buttons in by hand with doubled up white thread. And just like that, it's time for the reveal.
Okay, wrap up time. Positives. I think the fabric is super comfortable. Obviously, I really like this Viscose challis for wearing. For sewing, it's a bit like wobbly, but for wearing, it's super comfortable. It's really, really nice, especially for like warm, hot summers like what we have. I think it turned out pretty cute. Really like the buttons that I picked, and I'm really happy that I used up all of that leftover fabric and now I don't have any more of that in my stash. Only like kind of downside I guess I have on this blouse, and this is like something that happens from trying a new pattern, and that is the fit. So I think it turned out a little bit too baggy, and I still have to figure out, I think I probably could have gone down a size at least. So I did a size 8 straight, and I probably should have done a size 6 straight
so that I could then, you know, tweak that. Turned out too big. There's like too much space here in the sleeves. There's just like too much space everywhere, except around the neck. I have to check if the neckline is the same for all sizes. I hope so. If the neckline gets any smaller, it will be uncomfortable. Like it's at the point now where it's like borderline too tight. Like it's not tight, but if it was any like higher up, any smaller, it would be too tight on me. I need to kind of figure out with the like sizing down what the neckline situation is going to be, because that's going to be important for the blouse to actually be comfortable on me. This blouse also calls for bound buttonholes, which I still haven't done. I've never tried that technique, and it is something I want to try because I feel like if I'm trying to encourage people to not be intimidated by things that seem intimidating to them for whatever reasons, why am I intimidated by bound buttonholes? Like, I'm sure they can't be that difficult. Like, I will figure it out, even if it is hard the first time. Everything else I've done so far was quite difficult the first time I did it, and now it's easy. So, you know, I'm sure I'm going to figure it out. But I am happy I didn't try it on this blouse. I was kind of short for time, and I decided to just skip it and do it on a project where I am more particular about the, like, I really want it to be super neat and super perfect, and also on a project where I'm kind of working at a more relaxed pace. I still think that the top turned out really cute, and I still am going to get wear out of it. Like I said at the beginning, this was always going to be a wearable mock-up, so I was prepared for it to not fit perfectly, and I'm still going to wear it. I just isn't the fit that I was looking for. That is my rambly wrap up. I am pretty pleased with it, and I am going to get wear out of it. So in the end, it turned out fine. Now I have a blouse that matches with my partner. Will we wear it at the same time? Probably not, but the option exists, shall we want to do it. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more of me and my sewing shenanigans, then you should subscribe to my channel because I try to post new videos every Friday. And you may also want to follow me on Instagram or TikTok. I do try to post on there every day. I usually post on stories and stuff, and it is a good place to get more content that is maybe a little bit different to what you get in these long videos. And also, especially Instagram, it's a good place to know what I'm up to and to get lots of photos of my dog. Thanks for watching. Happy sewing.
Hello. Hello. You taking advantage of the sun? Yeah. Hello. Yeah, little toothbrush.